When my husband said, "You're holding us back," I thought he meant the roses I refused to cut, but then he slid a brochure for active senior communities across the table like a severance package and added, "It's time to think about what's best for everyone." And I asked, "Everyone meaning you and the woman who made you take off your ring?" Because there was a pale band on his finger like a lie that got sunburned, and he stared too hard at his coffee and said, "Don't make this ugly." And I said, "You already did." And the kettle clicked in the silence like a camera taking the first photo of the end, and I remembered the winter we couldn't afford heat and I wore 2 sweaters so the children wouldn't see me shiver, and the spring I painted these walls while he worked late, and I thought, 62 is not old enough to be packed in foam and shipped to a building with indoor bingo, and I said, "I'm not moving," and he said, "Let's not be dramatic," and I said, "You are proposing to remove the person who paid for half this house and cleaned all of it," and he smiled with that salesman calm he brings out for gullible strangers and said, "The kids agree it's time to simplify." And my spoon stopped in midair because I did not know we were voting on my life in a room I wasn't invited to, and I said, "Which kids?" And he said, "Both, actually." And right on cue my phone lit up with a new group chat called Family Planning, and I almost admired the neatness of it until I saw that the old family chat had been renamed Old Photos, as if I were already a memory file, and my daughter wrote, "Mom, Dad just wants you safe and happy," and my son added, "We found a lovely place with a garden," and I typed, "I have a garden," and no one answered for a full minute, just the blinking promise of dots that never arrive, and then my husband said, "There'll be housekeeping," like I was a dusty chair, and he pushed another paper from under the brochure, a list titled Transition Tasks with bullet points that included mail forwarding, password inventory, and medical contacts, and I asked, very calmly, "When did I become a task?" And he said, "Don't take it that way," and I said, "There is no other way." And he made that face men make when they realize you aren't going to cry or beg and he'll have to use a different tool. And he said, "The market is hot. If we sell this place now we can help the kids, set up our future." And I said, "Our future looks fine in my kitchen." And he said, "You've been misplacing things, it worries us." And I said, "I misplace my patience, not my name." And he said, "This tone isn't helping." And I said, "Helping whom?" And he didn't answer because the truth has a way of clogging the throat. And then my daughter called with her voice already set to caregiver, "Hey, Mom, maybe we come by later and sort the paperwork, just to get ahead of it." And I said, "Ahead of what?" And she said, "You know, which is the slipperiest sentence in the language." And I said, "Come if you like, bring gloves, there's ink." And when I hung up I looked at my husband and asked the stupidest smart question, "Is she younger?" And he said nothing the way cowards say everything. And I said, "How long?" And he exhaled like a punctured tire and said, "It's not serious." And I said, "She made you take off your ring. That looks serious on my table." And he said, "It's complicated." And I laughed because the only thing complicated here was the tangle of justifications he planned to wrap around my throat until I called it a scarf. And I stood up, feeling every year and none of them, and I took the brochure and wrote across the front with a pen that has signed mortgages, permission slips and apologies, "Not dead yet," and I put it on the fridge where it would watch him open the door for milk like a witness. And then I opened the drawer with the spare keys and noticed the bowl was 1 key lighter, and I said, "Where's the back door key?" And he said, "Probably in the car," and he said it too fast. And I thought of the locksmith vans that buzz around our street like flies, and I thought of the word simplify on his list like bleach poured on a map, and I said, "If you change a lock in my house without me, that's not simplification, that's a small coup." And he muttered something about safety, slippery stairs, my forgetfulness, and I felt the sharp animal in me raise its head because I am allowed to forget where I put the scissors, but I am not allowed to forget who I am. And who I am is the woman who kept this place standing while storms tried to take the roof and grief tried to take the light. And then there was a soft knock and my son walked in like he lived here, which he does not. And he looked at his father first, the way boys do when they've been handed a script, and he said, "Mom, can we talk like adults?" And I said, "I am an adult. You may borrow the costume." And he winced and said, "Don't be cruel." And I said, "Cruel is suggesting I downsize my life so you can upsize yours." And he said, "It's not like that." And I said, "Explain it like it is." And he glanced at the list on the table and said, "We were thinking if you moved this summer it would be easier before the holidays." And I said, "Easier for whom?" And he said, "For everyone." And I said, "Everyone always means not me." And my husband put a hand on our son's shoulder and I watched it like a stage direction, and my son tried again. With the voice he uses at work, "It's about planning." And I said, "Then plan to face me." And he swallowed and said, "You've seemed overwhelmed." And I said, "By what? Dusting 2 extra people?" And he looked at his father and I saw the secret pass between them like a note in class. And I decided in that second to hunt the paper trail they were hoping would stay invisible. And I said, "Fine, bring me every document you have printed about me." And my husband said, "You're overreacting." And I said, "I am reacting at the correct size for theft." And he barked, "No one is stealing." And I said, "Then you won't mind if I review the deed, the mortgage, the insurance, my accounts, your accounts, the passwords you're suddenly interested in inventorying, the medical contacts you'd like to centralize." And the word centralize tasted like metal in my mouth. And my son said, "We can do this peacefully." And I said, "Peace lives in daylight." And he nodded like that meant something and said, they'd be back at 6 with a few things to look over. And I smiled because they thought this was about my feelings. And it is not, it is about my spine. And when they left I locked the door and counted the keys left in the bowl and wrote down the number and the time and the temperature of my anger. And I took out a blue notebook and on the first page I wrote, in letters steadier than my breath, "Items people touch when they plan to remove you." And line 1 was keys, line 2 was mail, line 3 was your name on something you paid for, and line 4, underlined twice, was your children's silence. And before 6 o'clock I pulled the deed from the fireproof box and the insurance from the folder with the dog-eared corner, and I placed them on the table like bones, and I told the woman in the window who looks like me that if a war was coming, we would not be the ones who forgot where we put our armor. At 6 o'clock sharp they came back like a pair of salesmen with rehearsed smiles and a stack of papers tucked in a neat folder, my daughter trailing behind them with her lips pressed into that polite line she uses when she thinks she is being the adult in the room. And I stayed seated at the head of the table where I have carved turkeys and paid bills and cried into envelopes. And I said, "Lay it down." And my husband tried to laugh like this was all a misunderstanding, but my son slid the folder across as if he was closing a deal, and inside were 3 documents that smelled like betrayal. The first a draft of a property transfer that had my name in the smallest font. The second a so-called joint account authorization with his signature already planted like a weed. And the third a health directive template with my birth date typed wrong and my maiden name misspelled. And I asked, "Who prepared these?" And my son said, "It's just boilerplate. Nothing binding yet." And I said, "Boilerplate burns." And my husband said, "We're trying to protect you." And I said, "Protection is a roof that doesn't leak. This is a knife with a smile." And my daughter, bless her confused heart, whispered, "Mom, maybe just listen." And I turned to her and said, "Listening is what I have been doing while they plotted." And she looked at the floor like a girl again, and I saw the hesitation bloom in her eyes, a small crack in their plan, so I leaned into it and said, "Did you know about the ring, about the brochures, about the locksmith?" And she shook her head no. And my son said, "That's not relevant." And I said, "Relevance is the only thing standing between truth and theft." And my husband snapped, "Stop this act." And I said, "The act is you pretending to be a guardian when you are the thief." And the silence after was a cathedral. Even the refrigerator stopped humming. And then he said, "If you won't cooperate, we'll have to seek legal advice." and I laughed because that was exactly what I wanted, daylight and signatures and witnesses, and I said, "Good, then let us all stand in front of a judge and see who forgets their vows first." And my son slammed his hand on the table and said, "Why are you making this so hard?" And I said, "Because my name is still on the deed and my blood is still in these walls, and you can't scrub either with a folder of lies." And I picked up my blue notebook and I wrote their words down while they watched, every syllable like nails in a coffin they were building for themselves. And when they realized I was documenting, they went stiff, and my husband muttered, "She's unwell." And I said, "Yes, unwell with rage, unwell with the stench of betrayal, but not unwell enough to miss the way your hand shakes when you sign someone else's future." And my daughter whispered again, "Mom," her voice a plea this time, and I squeezed her hand and said, "You will not be the child who sells her mother to buy peace." And she nodded with wet eyes. And my son stood like he was ready to walk out forever, and I told him, "If you leave tonight, know that your place in this house will not wait for you like it always has. The door will be locked and the keys counted." And my husband grabbed the folder and shoved the papers back like gathering weapons, and he said, "We'll come back with someone official." And I said, "Good, bring them, because ink tells the truth better than your mouth ever did." And they left in a flurry of footsteps and slammed doors, and the air smelled of metal and old storms. And I sat with my daughter in the dim light and she whispered, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't." And I believed her because betrayal has a sound and her voice didn't carry it. And I said, "Then remember this moment, because they will try to fold you into their story, and when they do, tell them your mother keeps receipts." And she nodded, and I felt the war shift, just slightly, like a board under my feet finding balance. And when the night grew quiet, I pulled out the deed and kissed the ink like a relic, and I promised myself that no one, not man nor child, would erase me without a battle so loud the walls themselves would testify. The next morning the phone rang before 8, and it was a voice too sweet, the kind nurses use when they wake you in hospitals, and she said, "Good morning. I'm calling from the Office of Senior Services. We received a referral that you might need a home safety assessment." And I said, "A referral from whom?" And she said, "That's confidential, ma'am." And I almost laughed because confidentiality is a curtain people hide their knives behind. And I said, "Come if you must, but bring your clipboard and write every word I say." And by noon a woman in a navy vest was at my door with brochures about grab bars and fall risks, and she walked through my kitchen noting the rug, the stairs, the cabinet heights. And I watched her eyes land on the folder I had left open with the deed and insurance papers spread like shields, and I said, "Read them if you like. They tell the story you weren't supposed to hear." And she cleared her throat and said, "Do you feel safe at home?" And I said, "I feel unsafe with people who smile and call ahead with secrets." And she scribbled something, and I leaned over to read, and she tried to cover it but not before I saw the words "possible diminished judgment." And I said, "Write this instead. Subject cooks 3 meals a day, organizes bills, keeps home clean, tends garden, maintains sharp memory of dates, documents, and betrayals." And she blinked and wrote slower after that. And when she left I took a photo of her badge number and car plate, and I watched as she walked to the corner where my husband's car idled, engine running, window rolled down just enough for him to catch her nod, and I thought, so this is how it begins, with paper masks and staged concern. And that night my son came by with his voice rehearsed and said, "Mom, they just want to help." And I said, "Help is holding a ladder, not kicking it." And he sighed and said, "You're making this harder." And I said, "Harder than lying." And he said, "If you'd just sign some of the forms we could avoid court." And I said, "Court," tasting the word like metal. And he nodded like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. And I said, "Then let the gavel fall, because I'd rather stand in front of a judge than bow to you at my own table." And he left in a rush, and minutes later my daughter texted me in secret, "I believe you, Mom. I see it now." And I typed back, "Save everything. Screenshots are stronger than promises, and she sent me 3 messages my brother had forwarded. From the new family chat, words about me being confused, erratic, unsafe, and I added them to my blue notebook under a heading written so hard the pen almost tore the page. Lies they tell to steal a life. And as I turned off the lights that night, I stood in my hallway, hand on the wall that still held the height marks of my children from years gone by, and I swore aloud, "You will not erase me while these walls still carry my ink," and the house creaked back at me like a witness sworn under oath. A week later, the neighbors started looking at me the way people do at funerals, too gentle, too long, and Mrs. Riley from across the street whispered, "Are you all right, dear? I heard you've been having episodes," and I said, "The only episodes I have are on Netflix," but her eyes darted to my yard as if expecting to see broken glass and confusion, and that was when I realized the gossip had already been seeded, watered, and was now blooming across every hedge on the block. And when I asked her who told her, she flushed and said, "Just people who care," which is the ugliest phrase I know because caring doesn't sound like poison passed hand to hand. And that evening a letter appeared in my mailbox from the Homeowners Association citing complaints of hazardous clutter, a rake leaning against the fence, a cracked flower pot, both things that had lived in my yard for years without causing catastrophe. And I pictured my husband and son writing anonymous notes with smug grins, and I wrote the date and time in my blue notebook and labeled it Manufactured Concern, Exhibit A, and then I called the number on the letter and asked for specifics, and when the woman on the line hesitated, I said, "Was the complaint from the household at number 32, and she stammered, "We can't reveal that," and I said, "That means yes," and she hung up faster than truth can run, and the next morning my daughter brought me a casserole like a peace offering and whispered, "They've been saying you leave the stove on," and I marched her to the kitchen, showed her the working timers, the tidy counters, the checklist I keep on the fridge, and I said, "Repeat that lie again and I'll sue whoever's lips carried it," and she nodded with tears because she had believed some of it, just enough to make me angry at how easily trust can be bent. And later that night a manila envelope slid under my door while I was in the bath, and inside was a care plan draft with my name typed in block letters and boxes checked for assisted decision-making and restricted financial access, and at the bottom in shaky black ink was my signature, only it wasn't mine, the loops too fat, the slant too neat, the forgery obvious to anyone who has watched me write grocery lists with a trembling hand from years of arthritis. And I sat dripping on the tile with that paper spread across my lap, and I thought, this is how they will try to erase me, one forged curve at a time. And I whispered to the steam, "Not while I still have breath," and when the water cooled I dried off and laid the paper flat under a heavy book, took photographs from every angle, and logged it in my notebook under forged evidence, Exhibit B. And I swore that if they wanted war in court, then I would walk into that room carrying a mountain of proof taller than their ambition. And as I closed the curtains for the night, I saw my husband's car again idling at the curb, a silhouette beside him in the passenger seat with hair too bright and skin too young, and I thought, so this is her, the ghost I've been competing with, and I smiled because she had no idea she was stepping into a fire built from every betrayal, and the flames were already licking at her pretty shoes. 2 days later I came home from the market to find the lock stiff, my key struggling in the back door like the metal itself knew it had been betrayed, and when it finally turned I stepped into a silence that felt staged, a pause before the curtain lifts, and on the counter lay another folder, this one thicker, stamped with the name of a law firm downtown, and my husband sat at the table with his arms folded like a man pretending to be calm, and he said, "We need to be reasonable," and I said, "Reasonable is not changing locks while your wife is buying bread," and he said, "You're being paranoid," and I held up the folder and said, "Paranoia doesn't come printed on letterhead," and inside were documents labeled Petition for Guardianship, my name typed beneath words like incapacitated, erratic, unsafe, and there were affidavits signed by my son, bland lines about forgetfulness, misplacing bills, confusing names, none of which had ever happened outside their imaginations, and I looked at my husband and asked, "Did you dictate this?" And he didn't answer, his jaw tightening the way it does when guilt settles like a stone, and I said, "You want me erased because I know the smell of her perfume and the curve of her smile in your rearview mirror." And he barked, "Stop this nonsense." But his eyes flickered and that was answer enough, and then my daughter came rushing in, pale, holding her phone, and she whispered, "Mom, they told me you agreed to this," and I shoved the folder at her and said, "Does this sound like agreement?" And her hands shook as she read and she whispered, "I never signed anything." And my husband said sharply, "Stay out of it." And she snapped back, "She's my mother, I am already in it." And that was the first time she looked at him with something other than obedience, and I knew then the tide was shifting, so I pressed harder. I said, "Check the signature page," and sure enough there was my name again, curved and false, dated last week while I had been at the doctor, and I pulled out the clinic receipt from my purse and slapped it on the table, proof of my whereabouts, and I said, "Forgery is not love, it is theft with a pen," and my husband lunged to grab the paper but my daughter snatched it first, clutching it to her chest like scripture, and she said, "This is illegal," and he barked, "It's for her safety," and I said, "Safety is not hiding in parked cars with girls half your age," and the silence after cracked like ice. My son muttered something about just trying to help, but his voice was smaller now, weaker, and I saw the doubt creeping in, so I wrote every detail into my blue notebook, time-stamped, witnesses named, signatures photographed, and I said aloud, "If you drag me into court, I will walk in carrying the truth so heavy you won't be able to lift your head." And I looked each of them in the eye and I felt my rage settle into something steadier, colder, the kind of steel women carry when the men they trusted have plotted their burial, and I whispered, "I am not dead yet, and I am not leaving," and the house itself seemed to hum in agreement, its walls holding me upright like an old friend who has seen worse storms and survived every one. In the morning I dressed like a woman who intends to be believed, good jacket, clean hair, my wedding ring left on the dresser like a small truth that no longer fit, and I called Mrs. Patel's niece who knows a property attorney, and by noon I was in a downtown office that smelled like paper and decisions, and the attorney, Ms. Navarro, listened without interrupting while I laid the folder, the forged signature, the wellness card, the HOA notice, the group chat screenshots, the clinic receipt, and the list titled Petition for Guardianship across her desk like a battlefield map, and when I finally stopped she tapped one manicured finger on the fake signature and said, "We start here," and I said, "With rage or with ink?" and she said, "Both, but mostly ink," and she drafted a letter to the law firm whose stamp sat on that petition, a letter with teeth, demanding withdrawal of any emergency application, notice of all filings, preservation of evidence, and she handed me a checklist that looked a lot like my blue notebook had climbed into a suit: police report for forgery, doctor's letter attesting to capacity, bank logins audit, locksmith invoice and statement notarized, neighbor affidavits. And when I told her the locksmith had already admitted on the phone that a younger woman claimed to be owner, she smiled the way women smile when the ground of a lie begins to crack, and she said, "Get him to write it and sign it," and I said, "He will." And then she turned the page and said, "If they've already filed, the court will set a hearing. If they file ex parte we move fast. You will not walk into that room alone." And my throat closed for one beat because alone had been the word I'd been swallowing all week, and I nodded and said, "I have a daughter who just stopped believing their weather report," and Ms. Navarro said, "Good. We like witnesses who learn to read clouds," and I left her office taller than I had arrived and drove straight to the precinct where I filed the report with a young officer who kept calling me ma'am until my story made his eyebrows lift like wings, and he photographed the forged page and stapled my clinic receipt to the form and gave me the case number. And I wrote it in my blue notebook under a new heading, Law That Belongs to Me. And then I went to the locksmith's storefront with the striped awning and stood at the counter while a man wiped his hands on a rag and said, "You're the lady from 32. And I said, "I'm the owner of 32. And he reddened and said, "I remember." The younger woman was in a hurry, and I asked if he would write exactly that with the date and time and the name he wrote on the invoice. And he did, his pen scratching like a little saw through their story. And I handed him a copy of my police report number, and he nodded like this was a show he had seen before and disliked each time. And then I stopped by the county recorder's office, and the clerk with the tired eyes let me search the public terminal, and nothing new sat on my parcel file. But she leaned and said, "Check weekly." And I said, "Daily." And she smiled because she recognized a woman who knows that vigilance is a kind of prayer. And when I got home, a white envelope with my husband's neat block letters waited on the mat, and inside there was a single sheet torn from a legal pad. "Please stop escalating. You're embarrassing yourself." And I turned the paper over as if he might have written the truth on the back, and found nothing but the shadow of his pressure. And I laughed, a small unkind sound I did not apologize for. And I texted my daughter, "At 5 I need you here. Bring your patience and your phone." And she sent back a heart and a camera emoji because she has learned quickly. And at exactly 5 my husband arrived with my son, both of them with faces arranged for pity. And I met them on the porch so the house wouldn't have to hear their voices. And my husband said, "Can we please keep this private?" And I said, "Private is where you planted all of this. We are moving to daylight." And he sighed and said, "You don't have to make everything a fight." And I said, "You started the fight with a locksmith." And my son tried, "Mom, we're worried." And I said, "Worried people don't forge signatures." And he started to say something about misunderstanding, and I held up the notarized locksmith statement like a mirror and watched their faces change shape. And then I took out my phone and pressed record and said, very clearly, "Did either of you direct a change of locks at this property last Tuesday?" And my husband's jaw flexed and he said, "For safety." And I said, "That's a yes." And my son whispered, "Mom." And I said, "Next question. Did either of you refer me to senior services without informing me?" And my husband said, "Neighbors talk." And I said, "That's not an answer." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Third, who drafted the guardianship petition?" And he said the firm's name, low, like a confession. And my daughter, who had been quiet behind the screen door, stepped out and said, "Did you tell them Mom signed anything?" And my husband pinched the bridge of his nose and said, "It's complicated." And she snapped, "No, Dad, it's criminal." And for the first time my son looked actually afraid, not of me but of paper. And I saw the boy I'd once pulled out of a creek by the hood of his jacket, sputtering, wide-eyed, and I softened just enough to say, "You can step onto the right side of this any time." And his mouth opened and closed like a porch light flickering. And he said, "I didn't know about the forgery." And my husband shot him a look that could have cut rope. And I turned to my husband and said, "You wanted me small and grateful for a room with rails. And now you get me as I am." And he muttered, "You're overreacting." And I said, "To what?" "Attempted theft of my life." And then my phone chimed and it was Ms. Navarro, filed appearance. "If they push emergency hearing, judge assigned, Carter. Capacity letter will help. Doctor tomorrow." And I typed back, "Yes." 9 a.m. And I said to the men who used to be my family, "Tomorrow my doctor will put on paper what I have already demonstrated, that I am competent, furious, and precise." And my husband rolled his eyes like a teenager and said, "This is humiliating." And I said, "Good." And my daughter laughed once, shocked at her own joy. And my son whispered, "Dad, stop." And the porch light kicked on though the sky was still blue and a moth flung itself toward a bulb it could not understand. And in that sad fluttering I saw the shape of the woman in the passenger seat of his idling car, the perfume smudged on the collar he thought I didn't smell. And I said, "How is she handling all this?" And he flinched and said, "There is no she." And I said, Then God himself forged my name, and he stepped down from the porch like the ground had become hot, and my son stood stuck between us, and I said to him, very quietly, "You do not have to drown to prove loyalty to a man who brought the flood," and he lowered his head and whispered, "I'll be at court," and I nodded and let him go. And after they left, my daughter and I sat at the table sorting documents into piles like we were shelling peas: bank, deed, insurance, wellness, HOA, locksmith, texts, and I showed her how to label each with date, time, witness, and I told her the story of the winter the pipes burst, and I kept the water off the wiring with pots and towels while her father worked late, and she shook her head and said, "I thought stability was his gift," and I said, "Stability is what women build out of drafts and receipts while men announce it," and the kettle clicked and the house exhaled, and for the first time in days I felt something like oxygen return, and I wrote one more line in the blue notebook before bed, the ink steady, the hand mine, the sentence a promise. Tomorrow I let a judge hear my heartbeat in every comma I place on the page. The doctor's office smelled of antiseptic and lavender hand soap, and when Dr. Khan walked in she smiled the way only someone who has known you 20 years can smile, no pity, no performance, just recognition, and she said, "They've been calling me," and I said, "I expected as much," and she sat across from me with her tablet and said, "Let's make this official," and she asked me questions the way judges will one day: today's date, the president's name, the capital of our state, and I answered each without hesitation. Then she asked me to count backwards by sevens and I laughed, easier than counting how many lies I've collected this week, and she chuckled but typed with precision. And when she asked about my daily routines, I pulled from my bag the receipts for groceries, the bank statements with my handwriting in the margins, the HOA notice annotated with my own fury, and she said, "You've kept a meticulous log," and I said, "I learned from raising children who thought hiding mud on the carpet would fool me," and she shook her head in admiration and wrote, "Patient demonstrates intact judgment, insight, and memory, no signs of dementia, no cognitive impairment," and she printed it on letterhead with her license number at the bottom. And when she signed it, I thought the sound of her pen was louder than any gavel, and I hugged her on the way out and whispered, "You just gave me my shield," and she whispered back, "Go swing it." I drove straight to Ms. Navarro's office and laid the letter on her desk like a crown jewel, and she smiled and said, "This will carry weight," and then she told me the petition had been filed ex parte, emergency, hearing in 3 days, Judge Carter presiding, and I felt my stomach tighten but not collapse, because now I had proof, and I said, "Good, let's fight in daylight," and she nodded and slid me another checklist: character witnesses, affidavits from neighbors, copies of police report, and locksmith statement, bank alerts, everything bound and indexed, and I spent the next 48 hours turning my dining room into a war room, my daughter beside me scanning pages with her phone, each file labeled like chapters in a book no one wanted me to write. And Mrs. Patel came over with cookies and whispered, "I'll testify, I saw the van, I heard the gossip," and I wrote her name down, and the young officer emailed me a scanned copy of my police report stamped received, and I printed 3 copies and clipped them, and when my son texted, "Please let's talk before court," I stared at the dots blinking and disappearing and finally wrote back, "Talk is what liars call it when they want you quiet," and he never replied. On the night before the hearing, my husband knocked on my bedroom door, not gently, and when I opened it he stood with his jaw tight and said, "You're going to humiliate all of us," and I said, "Only the guilty will be humiliated," and he said, "Do you really want the kids dragged through this?" and I said, "You dragged them the moment you forged my name," and he clenched his fists like words were weapons he couldn't hold, and he hissed, "You'll regret this," and I stepped closer, so close he had to look at the face he had once chosen and later betrayed, and I said, "Regret is yours, I sleep with truth," and I shut the door so hard the frame shuddered, and I sat on my bed with the blue notebook open and I wrote, "Last night before war, evidence ready, allies listed, courage intact, and I whispered to the house, "Tomorrow I am not old, I am not frail, I am not forgetful, I am the storm they built with their own lies," and the walls seemed to lean closer like a choir, promising to echo every word I planned to speak. The courthouse smelled of marble dust and coffee burned too long, and when I walked through the metal detector with my daughter at my side, the guard nodded at my blue notebook like it was a weapon, and in a way it was, a blade made of ink and memory. And we sat on a hard bench while my husband paced with his lawyer, a man in a sharp gray suit who kept whispering in his ear like a serpent feeding lines, and my son sat stiff 2 seats away staring at his shoes, while the woman I had seen in his car slipped into the back row in a red blouse too bright for the room, and she kept her eyes on me with that sly smile of someone who thinks the battle is already won, but she doesn't know how many nights I've rehearsed my testimony. And when the bailiff called our case, Judge Carter looked down from the bench with tired eyes but a steady voice, and my husband's lawyer began with words that painted me as fragile, confused, prone to wandering. He even cited the broken flower pot and the leaning rake from the HOA letter as evidence of decline, and when he said unsafe clutter I nearly laughed, because if a rake defines incapacity then half the neighborhood should be institutionalized. And then he produced the petition with my forged signature and said I had consented to a care plan, but the moment the page touched the clerk's hand Ms. Navarro rose like a blade and said, "Objection, forged, already reported to police, case number attached." And she handed the stamped report to the judge, who lifted his eyebrows and asked, "You're saying this signature is not yours?" And I stood, steady, and said, "Your Honor, I have been signing my name for 62 years. I know it's bones. That is not mine." And I held up the clinic receipt proving I was across town at the hour it was allegedly signed, and the judge compared the dates and nodded slowly. And then Ms. Navarro presented the locksmith's notarized statement, the officer's affidavit, the doctor's letter attesting to my sound mind, and the judge read each in silence broken only by the rustle of papers. And when my husband tried to interject about my supposed forgetfulness, Navarro cut him with a line so sharp the room froze. Forgetting to mention a mistress is not the same as dementia. And my husband flushed the color of spoiled fruit, and the red-bloused woman shrank into her chair, and my son whispered, "Dad," but the judge cleared his throat and said, "We will hear directly from the respondent," and I walked to the stand with my blue notebook clutched like scripture, and I told him everything, the brochures, the group chat, the wellness visits, the gossip, the forged signatures, the locksmith, the neighbors, the lies, every entry logged with date and detail. And when I finished, the room was silent, even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz quieter, and Judge Carter leaned forward and said, "Mrs. Vale, your testimony is clear, your documentation is thorough, and your capacity is unquestionable," and he turned to my husband and said, "This petition borders on fraudulent, and this court does not tolerate weaponizing the law against a competent adult," and he dismissed it with the strike of his gavel, the sound echoing like thunder. And for the first time in weeks I felt my lungs open wide, and I looked at my son and said quietly, "Do you see now?" And his eyes brimmed, but he nodded once, and I knew his loyalty had cracked away from the man who raised him in lies. And as we walked out of the courtroom I passed the woman in the red blouse, her perfume cheap and desperate, and I said, "Enjoy what scraps you've been promised, because the feast is gone," and she flinched like I had struck her. And outside the courthouse steps I lifted my face to the sun and whispered to myself, "Not dead yet, not erased, not conquered," and the sky seemed to hear me, bright and merciless, the way truth always is. Outside the courthouse the air felt lighter, but I knew the war wasn't finished, because men like my husband don't retreat, they regroup, and sure enough that evening I found another letter slipped under my door, this time softer in tone, written in his hand. "Let's settle this quietly, no more court, no more shame," as if shame belonged to me for defending my own name, and I sat at the table with my daughter reading it aloud, And she said, "He doesn't stop." And I said, "Predators rarely do." Until the light burns their eyes, and I tucked the letter into my blue notebook under the heading Desperate Appeals, Exhibit F, and the next morning the phone rang again, this time from a blocked number, a woman's voice smooth as butter saying, "Maybe you should just sign the house over, wouldn't it be easier for everyone?" And I said, "Tell him to call me himself," and she hung up before I finished the sentence, but I recognized the tone, the perfume that had clung to his collar, and I smiled. Because nothing confirms guilt like a mistress doing the dirty work. And later that day Mrs. Patel told me my husband had been going door to door in the neighborhood, telling people I was ill, that I had collapsed, that he was handling things until I was placed somewhere safe, and I laughed so loud the birds startled from the trees, and I told her, "Write down the date and time, this too will live in my notebook," and she nodded like a soldier and promised to stand for me if needed. That night my son came alone, no folder, no lawyer, no wife, and he sat in my kitchen like a boy again and said, "I didn't know how far Dad would go," and I poured him tea in the cup he always claimed as his and I said, "When someone shows you their bottomless pit, don't lean in to measure it," and he hung his head and whispered, "I thought we were helping," and I said, "Helping is carrying groceries, not stealing deeds," and he wept, quiet, ashamed, and when he left I felt both sadness and victory tangled in my ribs, because betrayal from a child cuts deep, but recognition is its own bandage. The next day my husband's lawyer sent another notice, a proposal for mediation, but Ms. Navarro laughed when she saw it and said, "They are scrambling." The judge's dismissal was a blow, and she drafted a response so cold it could have frozen rivers, and I added it to my growing stack. That evening as the sun bled orange across the kitchen wall, I sat alone with my notebook, flipping through the pages, keys, mail, forged papers, gossip, false petitions, desperate letters, and I thought, they built this case to bury me, but all they've done is dig a hole for themselves, and I whispered to the empty room, I am not leaving my home, I am not leaving myself, and the walls, those faithful walls, seemed to lean closer, steadying me like old friends who had been watching all along. The mediation never happened, because by the time their lawyer tried to set a date Ms. Navarro had already filed a motion for sanctions, attaching every piece of evidence we had gathered, and when the court clerk called me and I watched my husband's face sag as the list was read, attempted fraud, forgery, harassment, abusive process, and his lawyer's voice cracked like old glass when he tried to argue intent, but Judge Carter held up a hand and said, "Enough, the evidence speaks louder than your excuses," and he turned to me and asked if I wished to pursue criminal charges, and I looked at my husband, the man I once trusted, and I said, "I want the truth on record and my name left untouched, whatever justice requires beyond that, I will not shrink from it," and the judge nodded and scheduled a hearing on sanctions, but his eyes told me he had already made up his mind. Outside the courthouse the reporters were waiting, because someone had leaked the story of a guardianship petition gone wrong, and microphones flashed toward me, questions like arrows. Did your family really forge your signature? Do you feel safe? Are you going to divorce him? And I said, safety is not given by signatures, it is earned by honesty, and as for divorce, you can't lose what already walked away, and my words spread faster than I expected, neighbors whispering, colleagues from years back sending letters of support, even strangers mailing me notes that said, "You remind me of my mother, fight on," and I pinned them on the fridge like armor. Meanwhile the woman in the red blouse vanished, no more idling cars at the curb, no more perfume on his shirts, and I knew she had slipped away the moment she realized I wasn't weak enough to surrender, and one evening my husband stumbled and drunk, his tie crooked, his eyes watery, and he slurred, "You've ruined me," and I said, "You ruined yourself the day you chose deceit over dignity," and he tried to grab my arm but I stepped back and said, "Touch me and I'll add assault to the list," and he dropped his hand, muttering, "Everyone's laughing at me." And I said, "They're not laughing at you, they're learning from you, learning how betrayal turns into ash." And he left again, the door slamming like a coward's drumbeat. That night I wrote in my notebook, not evidence but a vow: never again will I let someone fold my life into paperwork and call it love. Never again will I mistake control for care. And as I set the notebook down, I realized something. The battle was no longer just about saving my home. It was about showing every woman who has been told she's too old, too fragile, too forgetful, that we still have claws sharp enough to carve our names in stone. And I whispered into the dark, "The war is nearly over, and I am still standing." The night before the sanctions hearing, he knocked at 9 with a face I used to recognize, soft around the eyes like the man who once held our babies at 3 in the morning. And he said, "Let's end this." And I said, "We will," in front of the judge. And he said, "No more courts, I brought an agreement." And he pulled a folded paper from his pocket like a magician palming a coin. And I watched how his hands shook and thought, lies don't like light. And he said, "You keep a small stipend, and the car, I take care of the sale and the bills, everyone moves on." And I said, translation, "You keep the house, the accounts, your girlfriend, and I get gas money." And he flinched and said, "There is no girlfriend." And I said, "Then who typed the email I printed that says subject, move mom out timeline, whose perfume wrote itself into your collar?" And he tried to laugh, but his mouth wouldn't quite follow orders. And I put my phone on the table face down but recording and said, "Say it clean. Why did you file a guardianship petition against a competent woman?" And he said, I panicked. And I said, "Over what?" And he said, "The market, the money, the kids." And I said, "Not the woman in red." And he stared at the salt shaker like it might rescue him and whispered, "She said it would be easier." And there it was, the confession shaped like a sigh. And I felt nothing but a cold clarity, the kind that lets surgeons cut and singers hit the note. And I said, "Take your paper and go." And he said, "You'll regret this." And I said, "Regret lives on your side of the bed." And I locked the door behind him and added a line to the blue notebook. He admits influence from third party, easier, says the word like a rope. In the morning my son arrived with a cardboard box he had pulled from the garage, dust on the lid, guilt on his face. And he said, "I don't want to be part of a lie anymore." And inside were printed emails, drafts of care plans, copies of my driver's license from a scan I never consented to, even a bullet list titled "Messaging if she resists." And beside it notes in a neat, unfamiliar hand: "Lean into safety, neighbors as validators, doctor's office soft pressure." All of it so tidy it made my teeth ache. And my daughter stood at my shoulder with her phone camera open like a shield and said, "We back this up twice." And we did, digital and paper. And I called Ms. Navarro and said, "The box exists." And she said, "Bring the fire." In court, Judge Carter looked sterner than before, the way men look when their patience has been used as a doormat. And Ms. Navarro walked the room through the timeline like a tour guide in a museum of bad choices: the locksmith statement, the police report, the capacity letter, the HOA complaint dates nested perfectly with the wellness referral, the petition dismissed for fraud. And then she said, "And now, Your Honor, documents obtained from the petitioner's household that show planning, scripting, and intent to leverage false narratives to remove a competent adult from her home." And she lifted the list titled "Messaging if she resists." And a sound went through the room like a kettle beginning to boil. And my husband's lawyer objected and said words like hearsay in context. And the judge said, "Sit down." And then he asked my husband, "Did you compile or cause to be compiled these talking points?" And my husband said, "I don't recall." And the judge said, "You recall enough to file a petition. You recall enough to hire a locksmith. Try again." And my husband said, quieter, "Yes." And the judge turned to me and said, "Mrs. Vale, do you seek a protective order?" And I said, "I seek light and distance." And he nodded and issued a no-contact provision as to my medical providers, banks, mail and property access. He barred any further attempts to change locks or forward mail. He ordered my husband to pay my attorney's fees within 30 days, and then, with a gravity that made the red second hand on the courtroom clock seem extra loud, he said, "This matter regarding forgery is referred to the district attorney's office for review," and I heard my daughter exhale like she'd been underwater for a year, and my son covered his face and cried, not performative, just a man realizing the cost of silence, and I stood very still because victory arrives quieter than you think, like a door unlocking, like air returning to a room you didn't notice had gone thin. Outside on the steps he tried one last time, soft and angry at once. "We could have kept this between us," and I said, "Between us is where you hid the knife," and he said, "People will talk," and I said, "Let them, maybe they'll warn someone else before the locksmith arrives," and he sneered, "You'll be alone," and I said, "Alone is better than owned," and the words tasted like metal and honey together, bitter and clean, and the reporters drifted closer, but I had nothing left for them today. Only a hand on my daughter's shoulder and a nod to my son that meant the door is not locked if you come clean, and we went home, not to celebrate. I don't celebrate survival, but to tidy, to label, to breathe. And we put the cardboard box on the dining table and sorted its contents into truth and more truth, and I wrote a last line for the day: sanctions granted, fees awarded, referral made, locks protected, mail protected, doctor protected, name protected, and the house sighed in the evening. Heat like an old animal settling, and I stood at the sink watching the garden I refused to downsize, the roses still unruly, the light still mine, and I thought of every woman who ever sat at a table with a man selling her future in a brochure, and I said aloud to no one and to everyone, "I am not a brochure, I am the deed," and somewhere far away a siren wailed and quieted, and I knew the last part of the war would not be legal at all. It would be the hardest thing, the thing we leave for last. Deciding what to do with a marriage that died long before the papers tried to bury me. The house was quiet after the storm of papers and hearings, but quiet does not always mean peace. Sometimes it means you are finally able to hear your own heartbeat, and mine was steady as I sat at the table surrounded by piles of evidence that had been my armor, the blue notebook open to its final page, and I thought of the years I had given this man, the youth, the laughter, the labor that no one ever applauds, and I thought of how he had twisted all of it into leverage to erase me, and I asked myself the question women too often avoid: what is left worth saving? And the answer came back like a bell: me, only me. A week after the sanctions hearing, the district attorney's office sent a letter confirming an investigation into the forgery, and my husband tried to call 3 times, but I let the machine catch his voice, hollow now, no more confidence, only pleading, and each message began with, "We can fix this," and ended with, "Don't ruin everything," as if he hadn't already set the fire, and I saved the recordings, not because I needed more evidence, but because someday I might need to remind myself how a liar sounds when the lies stop working. My son moved into a small apartment across town and told me he was ashamed, that he had been blind, and I told him blindness is forgivable if you stop closing your eyes on purpose, and he comes now on weekends to help in the garden, careful, quiet, as if every rose thorn is a confession, and my daughter stays often, her laughter in the kitchen like a patch on a torn quilt, and together we cook, we eat, we breathe, and I realize I am not alone. I was never alone. I only believed the stories written by men who wanted me smaller. The neighbors greet me with respect now, the gossip reversed. Mrs. Riley pressed a jar of jam into my hands and whispered, "You showed us all something," and Mrs. Patel hugs me like a sister, and the locksmith waves whenever he drives past as if to say, "I remember, and I'm on your side." At night I sit in my room with the window open, the summer air heavy with the scent of roses, and I think of the woman in red, probably gone now, chasing another man's promises, and I don't hate her. She was just another shadow used to build pressure against me, but I hope she remembers the look on my face in the courthouse, because that was the look of a woman who refused to vanish. My husband does not live here anymore. He signed a separation agreement under Navarro's sharp watch, and he sends checks that feel less like support and more like penance, and I cash them without shame, because penance is earned, and when the divorce is final I will sign my name with a flourish that no one can copy, and I will plant a new rose bush in the yard, unruly and wild, a reminder that beauty does not ask permission. Tonight I close my blue notebook, every page filled, and I place it in the fireproof box beside the deed and the insurance and the letters of support, and I whisper, "You tried to bury me under paper, but I built my fortress out of it," and the house groans softly in its bones as if to agree, and I walk from room to room touching the walls, not because I fear losing them anymore, but because they have stood witness, and in the quiet I realize the final victory is not the judge's gavel, not the sanctions or the referrals. It is me, alive, whole, unbroken, standing in the garden I refuse to abandon, my dignity intact, my story mine, and I say it aloud so the night can carry it further than I ever could, not dead yet, not erased, not conquered, and never again owned.